morning, everyone. Welcome to the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. I'm Liz Cohen. I'm dean here at the Institute, and I'm so glad to have you all here on this beautiful sunny day, finally. At the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, we support and convene scholars, policymakers, scientists, and artists from all around the world to work across disciplines and at the forefront of their fields. And we are committed to sharing that knowledge in thought-provoking discussion with a broad and interested public. In order to do that, Radcliffe offers a full calendar of public events throughout the year, including lectures, exhibitions, seminars, conferences, and more. For example, right now, you can visit an exhibition at the Schlesinger Library entitled Playing Fair, Title IX at 45, which displays photographs, video, and archival materials to tell the story of women athletes before and after the landmark legislation of Title IX. The exhibition can be found 2 doors down from this building at the Schlesinger Library, and it will be up until June. It's open all day, and you can visit during lunch or breaks today. Later this spring, we'll continue the exploration of Title IX's legacy and its impact with a panel discussion co-hosted with WBUR and featuring Maura Healey, who brings her experience not only as Massachusetts Attorney General, but as a former basketball player. Many people may not know that Maura co-captained the basketball team at Harvard as an undergraduate before going on to play professional basketball in Austria. Maura will be joined by Olympic ice hockey medalist Angela Ruggiero and Boston Globe and WBUR sports reporter Shira Springer for a probing discussion on the progress we have made towards gender equality in sports, as well as the obstacles that still remain. That panel will take place on Tuesday, May 16th at 7 p.m. right here in the Knaufel Center, and you can register on our website. And finally, on Friday, May 26th, our spring programming will culminate in Radcliffe Day, an annual celebration of Radcliffe's past, present, and future. Each year on this day, we award the Radcliffe Medal to a person who has had a transformative impact on society. This year, we will honor 2 women who have made a profound mark on the field of journalism, Judy Woodruff and the late Gwen Ifill. That day-long event is an opportunity to honor Judy and Gwen's groundbreaking accomplishments, both as a team and as individuals. It will include a panel discussion to probe the challenges facing journalism today. Please visit the Radcliffe website for more information on the day and how you can obtain tickets to attend. Today, we are gathered for Radcliffe's annual Gender Conference. Each year, we examine an issue such as violence, immigration, or the evolving use of language through the lens of gender. Such complex topics require an interdisciplinary approach, which we will bring to bear today, drawing on the expertise of coaches, CEOs, athletes, journalists, and a neurologist, just to name a few. A conference like this one is only possible with lots of help and support. I'd like to take a moment to thank everyone who has made today a reality. First, thank you to our supporters, many of whom are with us today. Your generosity allows us to ensure that events like this one remain free and open to the public. Thank you for your participation in our annual fund. Thank you as well to the faculty organizers of this conference, Janet Rich-Edwards and Yukio Lippett, who worked with Executive Director of Academic Ventures, Rebecca Wasserman, and her team to organize today's events. Thank you to the members of our hardworking planning committee, including Sean O'Donnell, Susan Ware, and Sherry Blowett. And thank you to the performers at last night's art event, as well as to the former fellows Lydia Diamond and Martha Ackman, whose collaboration brought that wonderful performance to life. And thank you to the many professors, coaches, students, and Harvard community members who gathered last spring to brainstorm for this conference with us, and they held associated events all year long related to today's conference. And finally, thanks to all of you who are coming here today for this conference from as near as Harvard Yard and as far away as Atlanta, San Francisco, and Lubbock, Texas. We also welcome many people from around the world who will be viewing our conference online. It's exciting for us to see such an enthusiastic response to this year's topic from so many quarters. One reason for such great interest in a conference about sports and gender is that the topic is both very timely and timeless. Its current relevance is all around us. Athletic teams at Harvard and at many other universities this year have had to confront troubling demonstrations of demeaning attitudes towards female athletes. Just last week, the U.S. women's hockey team made the news when they struck an unprecedented deal with USA Hockey for higher wages. All it took was the threat of a boycott, 15 months of tense negotiations, and an open letter from 16 U.S. senators. The questions raised by the intersection of gender and sports are certainly newsworthy today, but those questions have been present around the world for much of history. Early artwork from ancient Egypt to medieval Europe featured male and female human figures swinging at balls with sticks. But despite their widespread appearance across many times and places, neither sports nor gender are unchanging. Both are shaped by social, political, economic, and cultural context. Let me give you an example. In the early decades of the 19th century, sports were actually regarded poorly in Western society. Games were all very well for children, but for adults, sports were morally suspect. Men who aspired to social respectability rejected popular sports like prize fighting as vulgar and overly physical pastimes of the lower classes. But by the mid-19th century, things began to change with a new movement called muscular Christianity. Beginning in England and spreading to the northeastern United States, muscular Christianity equated physical fitness with moral health and linked both to masculinity. In order for members of the upper class, both men and women, to claim sports as elite and respectable, however, sports had to be repackaged from a rough and tumble pastime into an activity befitting gentlemen. And it wasn't an easy shift to make. As late as 1859, Harper's Magazine insisted that grown adults who indulged in sports must be either, and I quote, milksops or bad men. How then did proponents of athleticism finally legitimize men's participation in sports? Promoters of sporting events began inviting women to sports games in an effort to infuse those events with the values of Victorian womanhood, such as refinement, delicacy, and propriety. Team owners provided special tents and refreshments for women spectators, and women assumed specific roles, such as presenting bouquets or game balls to winning teams. For sports to become more respectable for men, both men and women took on new roles. Of course, in 1860, women's roles were decidedly limited. They could attend games. They could bestow flowers on winners. They could even play a number of sports, so long as they didn't keep score. As for competing, only men were supposed to do that, for fear that competition might make women too coarse. It should be clear that sports provide a powerful lens for understanding much larger questions of an historical time. And sports continue to offer that similar critical lens today. Now, as then, sports and gender are inseparable from each other. Now, as then, gender disparity is a major characteristic of sports. Today, women compete, but not on equal footing. Even in tennis, the sport lauded for coming closest to pay equity, discrepancies remain. In 2015, Roger Federer won the men's Western and Southern Open and received more than $700,000. Just hours later, Serena Williams, arguably the world's most outstanding athlete, won the women's title, and she collected a prize of less than $500,000. If inequities between men and women have persisted, in other ways, the relationship between sports and gender have changed over time. We now face questions about steroid use and athletic performance, neurological damage while competing, and the rights of transgender participants. These questions and more require an interdisciplinary approach capable of considering the many complexities of gender, sports, and society. That is what brings us all here today. I just want to say before we move on that we want to treat you to a reception at the end of the day at Fay House to celebrate our panelists and organizers. So I look forward to talking with you then. It is now my pleasure to turn things over to Susan Ware, who will moderate the first panel. Susan is an acclaimed historian and the biographer of such notable figures as Billie Jean King and Amelia Earhart, as well as the editor of the latest volume of Notable American Women, a biographical dictionary. Susan currently serves as general editor of the American National Biography, and she is also the honorary women's suffrage centennial historian at the Schlesinger Library here at Radcliffe. Please join me in welcoming Susan Ware.
Well, good morning. Thanks so much for coming, and very glad to have you here. This session is organized around a seemingly straightforward question: who gets to play? Yet, like many of the other issues we'll be discussing today, the answer is far from simple and certainly not static. Our main focus is on what role gender plays in access to sports, but we can't address that in isolation, so we'll also be exploring questions of race, class, sexual identity, and disability. We want to think carefully about which sports we're talking about: recreational sports, high school or college athletics, international competitions, or professional leagues. We want to explore how the United States system conforms to or differs from how sport is organized around the world. We want to think about special challenges to sports access. How can an athlete compete in international competition if she's a stateless refugee or cannot find the appropriate athletic gear to accommodate her religious beliefs? We won't necessarily be able to cover all of those topics, but we certainly hope that we will start conversations that will continue for the rest of the day. So in many ways, or in certain ways, this is the history panel. We're exploring how the question, who gets to play, has changed over time, and how this historical trajectory might influence who's next in staking a claim. So it seems especially appropriate that it's taking place in the former Radcliffe Gymnasium. One glorious summer afternoon several years ago, I snuck into the building in my running gear, and I ran 16 laps, a mile, around the upper level track. And as I circled the gym, I felt a literal connection through the floorboards to the generations of Radcliffe athletes who had also run on that track. What must they think, I wondered, of the opportunities available to female athletes today, opportunities that would have been inconceivable in their time, indeed inconceivable probably to certain members of this audience. And yet, and there's always that catch, so much has happened, especially in the last 5 decades, and yet women athletes are still nowhere near anything approaching gender equity in athletics. So drawing up a balance sheet between the undisputed progress in widening access versus the ongoing structural and societal barriers to full participation will be a recurring theme of our panel, indeed of the whole conference. And it's especially relevant to take stock as Title IX, the US law that played such an important part in fostering the revolution in women's sports, turns 45 this year, which is a plug to visit the exhibit documenting its history at the Schlesinger Library. So now it's time to hear about who gets to play from our stellar panel, whose full biographies are in the program. But I am delighted to share the stage with Donna Lopiano, who is the former CEO of the Women's Sports Foundation, one of my favorite groups, and now president of Sports Management Resources, with Anita DeFrantz, a longtime member of the International Olympic Committee, and boy, I'm sure she could tell us stories about that, and a bronze medalist in rowing at the 1976 Olympics, and Stephanie Wheeler, a 2004 and 2008 Paralympics gold medalist in women's wheelchair basketball, who now coaches at the University of Illinois. So after their presentations, the panelists will spend some time talking among themselves about common concerns and potential points of disagreement, and then we'll open the floor to questions. So with that, I just have to say, let the Game Changers games begin.
So it's my job in this first 15 minutes to give you the history of Title IX, to, from 30,000 feet, give you a sense of what the current statistics are, and to answer the question, how close are we to gender equity? And then I want to take a view from ground zero look at Harvard's athletic program, which I do. Wherever I go to speak, I always make sure that the home team gets my attention, for sure. So let me see if this works. Okay, so this is quick and dirty. Research shows that the faster the speaker speaks, the greater the retention of the audience, because you can't fall asleep. So this is, I learned that when I went to my first job at the University of Texas. Everybody was kind of scary in terms of Yankee speed of speech. Anyway, I've always referred to the civil rights laws in the U.S. as the perfect trifecta. They all use the same language, whether it's the Civil Rights Act of 1964 or the Title IX of the 1972 Education Amendments, or the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 followed by the Disabilities Act of 93. It's all the same language. If you are receiving federal funds, you cannot discriminate on the basis of, and then fill in the blank. You know, very simple law. Nobody knew it applied to intercollegiate athletics until the law firm, the Washington, D.C. law firm of the NCAA, asked the question in early 1974, does it apply to extracurricular activities? And the answer was then yes, but you should know that Title IX was never an athletics law. It was fully intended by Edith Green and Birch Bayh, who were the co-sponsors of the original law. It was fully intended to open the doors of professional graduate education to women. It was an Equal Pay Act issue at the time, that they realized that women couldn't get paid more if they didn't have advanced degrees. And there were quotas on the number of women who were admitted into medical school, who were admitted into law school, who became engineers. If your father didn't build a building, you didn't get into those programs because they were afraid you were going to have babies and your education would be absolutely wasted. But anyway, so the NCAA in 1974 says, does this law apply to intercollegiate athletics and extracurricular activities? The answer is yes, and all hell breaks loose. Darrell Royal, who was then the president of the American Football Coaches Association, was quoted across the country as Title IX and women's athletics would be the death of big-time football as we know it. Horrors to be. And one of the great things about the entry of the football establishment was that it was the invitation to the media to equally cover the issue. If Darrell said this about what was going to happen to football, what were the women going to say in terms of the effect of Title IX? And the leaders of women's athletics at the time were female physical educators, well-educated. They've researched the impact of sport participation on girls, and they hit the media with a salvo of research-supported fact that to this day has never been rivaled. They were quick. They didn't attack football. They were just simply saying, guess what? Girls who play sports are less likely to experience sexual harassment, are less likely to get a heart attack. They just listed all the physiological benefits of sport. Psychologically, they have stronger self-images, they have higher levels of confidence. They are more likely to succeed in life after sport. And the end question was, hey, sport does great things for your son and your daughter. Do you want your son and daughter to be treated equally? And the answer was a resounding yes. So this benefits to girls media message wielded by fact supporting, I know you haven't heard that recently, fact supporting women in the business really made a dent in terms of public sentiment, and you can see what the figures are in terms of the percentage of the public that is in support of Title IX, even if it means lost opportunities for men. And then the last point to be made historically is it really was a father-led movement. Mom never had the chance to play sports. Dad, all of a sudden, had a single point of contact with surrogate son. My daughter is playing sports. I can have a catch with her in the backyard. And the biggest advocates of sport became fathers. And it was this father-mother combo that really has been responsible for the staying power of the law. Let me mention one more piece of this puzzle. There was an accident in history that ensured that Title IX could never be tampered with. And that accident was when the football coaches made their stink. Congress responded by saying, we'll make sure that the regulations interpreting the law's application to sport get issued before the law goes into effect. So everybody knows, what the game's about. That never happens to regulations. Usually a law passes, it's, debated in the courts for 10 years, and then regulations eventually evolve. In this case, tons of regulations on the application of Title IX specific to sports were issued, and every single court case has deferred to those regulations. And you don't have any of the disagreements in the courts that typically follow the passage of a new law like this. And I think that accident of history is singularly responsible to, for the stableness, the stability of Title IX. All right, the view from 30,000 feet, and I'm going to go through this stuff, very quickly. When you look at high school sports, you're looking at, in 1971-72, men having about 3.6 million opportunities to play compared to 294,000 for women. What is interesting is when you look at it in 14-15, the last available data, women at the high school level still have not achieved the participation levels that men had in 1971. They are still 1.1 million opportunities short from matching up to their proportion in the general student body. And one thing this data shows us is that it has not been a zero-sum game. The fears that the football coaches and everybody else expressed with Title IX were, if you give women the chance to play, then they're going to take opportunities away from your son. And you can see from this data, it never happened. Men's participation, boys' participation has continued to grow at the high school and the college level. It has not been a zero-sum game. And interestingly, over the last decade, men's participation has grown at a quicker rate. More opportunities have been added for men than have been added for women, despite the fact that women are still underrepresented in high school sports. The picture at the college level is the same. It's almost identical. So you're looking at numbers in 72, 73 versus 14, 15. At the college level, 57% of all college undergraduates are female. Only 43% of all athletes are female. And same animal in terms of more opportunities have been added for men in the last 10 years than have been added for female. So instead of this gap getting smaller, which it started to do in the first 30 years or so, it's now starting to peel apart again. So the gap is greater. So why is this happening, right? As the wrestling coaches will tell you, every time a wrestling program is dropped, it's because of Title IX. Men's sports is suffering because of what's happening for women, with women. And the answer is just the opposite. What is happening is that men's sports are getting dropped so that money can shift to fund the arms race in football and basketball. And you can tell because men have been growing more than women, and women are still not close to equity, and nothing's been done over the last 10 years, you can tell that's true, but you can also tell from this chart. If you look at that bright yellow 328 up there, this shows you the net gain and loss of sport programs for men and women. You can't just look at drop programs. We add and drop sports all the time. In the 70s, women didn't play soccer. Men didn't play soccer in this country. We sure didn't play lacrosse. We were playing badminton. We were playing field hockey. So sports change all the time. So you have to look at what the net gains and losses are. So you can see that in women's sports, it's always net gains. In men's sport, in Division 2 and 3, which are the least financially supported sports, in Division 2 and 3, men's sports continue to grow. Division 1, the richest programs in the United States, are the ones that are dropping sports. And they're doing it to fuel this arms race. If you look at the percentage of the men's sport budgets that go to just these two sports, and knowing that Division 1 is the highest competitive level, you're looking at FBS, the college football playoff. 81% of the men's sports budgets among these 125 FBS institutions are 81% go to just those two sports. And the number that really kills me on this chart is look at Division 1, no football, third row down, right? Division 1, no football. So there's no football players, 0. There's just men's basketball. And men's basketball, those 12 players are getting 44% of the men's operating budget. So have no doubt that, why this is happening in terms of men's non-revenue sports being dropped. And just as this is a quick and dirty in terms of the financial support of men's versus women's sports, Title IX does not require equal dollars. It doesn't. But if you look at the money picture, follow the money, you can see there's smoke here. And where there's smoke, there's usually fire. And this gives you a good idea of how poorly women's sports are still supported in every single division. Yes, football is more expensive, than other sports. But when you look at these kind of funding gaps, I testify in Title IX lawsuits all the time. Believe me, there are very few institutions in this country that are in compliance with Title IX. Media coverage of women's sports, and Mike Messner, I love Mike Messner, is going to speak on this later on, so I'm not going to spend time on this. But fortunately, we have, Mike, is it still true that we are getting more coverage than horses and dogs? I got it. But seriously, horse racing and dog racing used to be covered more than the women. I think we might have surpassed that. Newspaper coverage is a function of what does the sports editor want to see, right? What does the sports editor want his writers to write about? Sports editors do not take surveys and see what the public wants. So we don't have very many women, or people of color for that matter, and sports editors. You can see that in our coverage. When you look at college sports leadership, this is where the real crimes are being wrought. You're looking at, roughly 80% of, I don't care whether you pick coaches, athletic directors, administrators, 80% are white males. And that's a large statement, but roughly that's about what it is. And these numbers are worse for persons of color. So you can see that in terms of employment, Title IX has not had a concomitant effect on women in terms of employment. And now the view from ground zero, and I know you don't have glasses, okay? So, and these are very small numbers, but I want you to look at the last column only, okay? This is the female participation gap at each of the Ivy League institutions. So that is the number of women's participation opportunities that need to be added for women to comprise their percentage in these respective student bodies. So I've kept men's participation constant and just did a simple mathematical formula, right? So as you can see, Harvard is only 122 shy in terms of having to do something more for women's sports. So I'm here to tell you that Harvard is not in compliance with Title IX. But why don't I end with that?
Well done. Thank you. Good morning. My name is Anita DeFrantz, and I come from points beyond. I was just in Denmark, where there was a gathering of all the international federations of the world that are part of the Olympic movement. And this is important to us because, in many senses, the Olympic movement has kept sports alive worldwide. Not intentionally, and certainly people know that Pierre de Coubertin wasn't that much of a fan of women's sport. In fact, he's quoted as saying that the purpose for women is to applaud politely the men as they endeavor through sport. To his credit, he never prohibited women from competing. He never put up a roadblock. He just did not support it much. I wanted you to get a sense for how the Olympic movement has grown. Sports opportunities have grown, and I hope you can see it better than I can. You'll see that in the year 19,000, the number of sports for women were 2, the number of National Olympic Committees were 5, and the number of participants were 22. As you go down, eventually you'll get to the Olympic winter sports when that lighter color is, boy, that's really hard for you to read, I'm sorry. The lighter cover is added. Then you have both the Olympic Winter Games. Look at 1924, both the Olympic Winter Games and the Olympic Games. Very modest number. The men's numbers are not that much more significantly, but over time, slowly but surely, we have more numbers. And that means across the world, if we were to put up the numbers of women competitors from the United States, it would be much larger than any other country, for which I am proud. I then learned that by the year 2000, there were fewer than 2,000 women who had represented the United States at the Olympic Games, which is such a tiny number. The numbers will get larger because we needed to do that. So this gives you a snapshot of the numbers of women competing at the Games throughout time, modern time, which for us started in 1900. Now this one, percentage is also important, the percentage of events for women, because at a certain point, women had a better chance at winning medals than men did mathematically, because there were actually more events for women and a smaller number of women competing, and that helped the National Olympic Committees recognize that they could be more successful if only they were to support their women, and they could go home with more medals. Now, I didn't announce this too loudly, but we kept putting the numbers up, and they finally got that. And indeed, you'll note starting in starting in 2008, 12, and 16, many of the larger teams had more women than men. And indeed, the mighty nation of Bhutan had no men, but only had women on their Olympic team in Rio de Janeiro. You start seeing that there is a recognition that your country can be made proud by having women athletes. When one of the goals of the IOC since our Congress in 1994, Congress means we bring together not just the International Olympic Committee, our annual meeting is called the session, but we bring together, along with the IOC members, the National Olympic Committee members. There are now 206 National Olympic Committee members. That's more members than there are members of the United Nations, in part because Puerto Rico has its own National Olympic Committee and others who would not necessarily be recognized by the UN as separate countries. So there are more NOCs than there are countries for historical reasons. And we also, for the Games in Rio, created something called the refugee team. We recognize that there are people in these refugee camps, some of whom have been there for decades, and we wanted the young people who've grown up there to have a chance to be Olympians. So the first ever refugee team competed in Rio. And by the way, we don't just say, okay, great, thanks for coming, you competed, you did well, bye. We stay with those members of the team. We help them get placed. We help them develop the skills they need to get back into society. And some of them are continuing to compete. So moving on, I wanted you to see the overall the curve. You'll see that the men aren't continually on an upward swing, but that's the total number of athletes at the Games, and the women start to go up and up and up. Just quickly, from 1900 to 1984, there were about 12,000 women who competed at the Olympic Games. From 1988 to 2016, there have been over 30,000 women who competed at the Olympic Games, which to me says that there's a large cadre of women available to give back, who are of the proper age group to be able to give their time and take on positions of leadership. The IOC has made it clear that we believe, if you can believe that we believe this, that the world is made up of at least 50% women, probably more, but at least 50% women, and therefore the number of athletes at the Games should reflect the world, and the number of positions in leadership should likewise reflect the world. Studies have been done throughout the world that show that boards of directors that are equally made up of women and men, what a shock, equality means. None of this equity stuff for me, equality. Those boards do a much better job of leading their organizations. They're much more successful than other boards. So if you know of any boards that are predominantly made up of one sex other than the other, you can just tell them they would do better if they get their act together and even it out. It's all for the better. That's what we want to do. We want to make things better. So you can see from this chart that slowly, far too slowly, but certainly we're moving towards equality at the Olympic Games. One other thing that happened as we moved towards more equality, we noticed that the reportage, the reporting at the Olympic Games became proportionate. In other words, if your team was made up of 40% men and 60% women, the reporting on the Games was made up of 60% women stories and 40% male stories. I don't know how the journalists do that, but it followed that trend, which is even more compelling to have equal numbers of athletes, men and women, in the Games, so we can get equal number of reporting. And the remarkable thing is they can do it for 2 weeks during the Games. I think you could probably do it forever if you really wanted to. It works. So we need to get people understanding that it does work, and the world will be a better place when we get more of the stories out there. Okay, the next slide has to do with the new sports on the program. There are new sports on the program, and that is one messed up chart, I'm sorry. Where it says a year, just put the 0 over, so it's 1900, 1994, things like that. So you can do that. You guys are at Radcliffe. You can move the chart, move the column. And you see how long it took to get some of the sports on the program, which is really amazing. 1976, which were the great games. Yes, that's when I competed. There we go. 1976, go. Yeah. Finally, rowing, basketball. Did you realize that women's basketball is not on the program of the Olympic Games till 1976? Then it goes much faster as we move along from that point. And the Games in London was the first Games when all of the sports on the program had women's events. It took us from, let's see, 1896 to 2012 to get all of the sports on the program for men, for women. It's often pointed out to me that men do not take part in synchronized swimming. Not true. At the FINA World Championships, men, it was a mixed event, and the gentleman who, those many years ago, complained bitterly that he was not allowed to compete, his duet actually won the World Championships in mixed synchronized swimming. I've lost his name, but I'm sure Twitter or Google or somebody can find his name for you. So yes, synchronized swimming has found its way to making opportunities for men and women. It's important to know that there are sports that continue to go on. In the Olympic Winter Games, we were coming very close to parity. Then new sports came on. And I will confess, I was asleep at the switch. I was no longer in charge of the Women in Sports Commission. And what happened was a lot of these new sports came on, and nobody was reminding them that you have to have equal numbers of women athletes and men athletes. And they didn't, because unfortunately, guys were in charge again, and guys do what they do. They say, okay, let's have a lot more guys here. Oh, women, let's have some women. These are new sports, so who's going to notice if we have twice as many men as women? Well, after the fact, I noticed, so it's going to take us a while to get back to equality at the Olympic Winter Games because of one set of games where they put 20 men in and only 10 women in the sport of, say, border cross. You all know what border cross is. And I'm not making a political comment on this. It's a lot of fun. You line up 4 skiers at the top of a essentially mogul's hill, and they race to get across to the finish line first, often bumping into one another along the way, making it exciting to see who will make it to the finish line. But that sport, well, you know, how many women really want to do that? Well, I'll tell you, a lot of women want to do that. It's fun, but not so many got the chance at the games. All right, now I do have to hurry along. The last games. What we do at the ILC is we pay attention. You'll see here, if you can see it, that we pay attention not only to the number of athletes there, but we pay attention to the National Olympic Committees and whether or not they have women in their leadership, where they have women, chef de mission, who is the person in charge of the team at the games, whether they have women as flag bearers, and where they have accredited media. We're looking at the numbers because if you watch the numbers, you can see if things are going the direction we say we want them to go or not. We are paying attention to how the games are presented. We're paying attention to who gets to be there and what their experiences are at the games. This has been a very fast overview of a very complicated, it's not the right word, but confusing might be, the way the Olympic movement is structured. The International Olympic Committee owns the Olympic Games. We're the only ones who can say, yes, this is where the Olympic Games will be. The IOC decides what sports will be on the program, but the international federations control the sports. The National Olympic Committees are the ones who enter the athletes. So, and it's often said that there's 3 pillars of the Olympic movement. Well, I think there are 4, and I prefer the pyramid, which oddly enough has 4 sides to it. We think of a pyramid and the triangle, but it has 4 sides. So I think the athletes are a very essential part of the Olympic movement. We have to have athletes, we have to have international federations, we have to have national Olympic committees, and we have to have the International Olympic Committee, or sports would exist, but the others would not without the International Olympic Committee. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. I've spoken a lot of Olympic language with alphabet soup, and I hope that you'll be able to remember the questions because you're going to hear a lot more interesting things than I have to offer. Bottom line, we had Title IX. How on earth did women get to the starting lines in the countries throughout the world that didn't have Title IX? In part, the NC2A helped that greatly to get women to the line, but it is really miraculous. And through the determination of other women like Alice Milliant, who was a French woman who in the 1920s made sure that women had track and field, they call it athletics, track and field, and she put on track and field events that had 20,000 spectators, which is why you see in 1928 track and field coming onto the Olympic program in the way it should have back in the 1900s. And with 1 minute and 22 seconds left, 20, I will end my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna stay here and do my presentation because you guys wouldn't be able to see me over there. So I'm kind of rounding everything up and talking about disability and how disability plays into who gets to play. And I come at this from a couple of different perspectives, 3 different perspectives actually as I go through my presentation. So the first is kind of a landscape of where we are with just disability sport. I think it's really relevant and important to talk about that before I move on to the gender piece because they intersect and they do play into one another. Then I'll talk a little bit about kind of the role that gender plays in disability sport and then wrap it up with a current example of kind of this question of who gets to play, where do they get to play, what's the structure around them getting to play. All right, so to start out with where we are, I'm not going to bore you guys with too much relevant U.S. law and case law, but I think the biggest thing to understand with that is, and I know Anita talks about this a lot in her presentations and what she believes as far as sport being a human right. and who's allowed to play. Well, as you guys can see through some of this US law and case law, for the longest time it's been a privilege for individuals with disabilities to be able to play sport. It has not been a right. And so the only way that they've been able to access sport, that we have been able to access sport, is through law that you see here, relevant US law, Title IX, Rehab Act, which Donna spoke about in her presentation, the ADA. And then relevant case law with Casey Martin versus the PGA, McFadden versus Cousins, which is Tatiana McFadden, who's a pretty well-known racer, female racer right now. And so those are the opportunities that we have had to sort of assert our right to play sport and our right to get to the line, basically. That's how we as individuals with disabilities get to the starting line quite often, is it has to be through relevant case law. The last two pieces, and more importantly, the last piece, the OCR Dear Colleague letter of 2013, that's been one of the most important pieces of clarification and legislation that's sort of moved our opportunity the most forward that I've seen it in the past, probably 10 to 15 years. And basically what that is was a clarification of Section 504 of the Rehab Act, stating that you do have to provide extracurricular opportunities for your students with disabilities in your schools. And so it's a clarification of that, saying this is what you have to do. Okay. So along with that kind of privilege by having to go through case law and having to go through US law, we talk a lot about who gets to make it to international and professional opportunities to play sport. On the left, you have able-bodied individuals. They kind of have this defined path of where you go: play, recreational level, youth sport level, scholastic, intercollegiate, national, international, professional, right? Like it's a pretty linear progression for able-bodied individuals to get there. On the right side, you have people with a disability, and we have play and recreation level to some extent. That's more at your interscholastic level, where you have opportunities for PE, or you have opportunities outside of school for those extracurricular activities. They're not completely there right now. They're moving in the right direction, but there's some opportunity that exists there. Youth and sport level, there are youth sport level opportunities for kids with disabilities to play sport, depending upon the sport. Scholastic, that's more of your high school. Not a lot of that exists outside of special recreation opportunities, special recreation associations. You don't see a lot of students who get to compete for their high school. You see it, and this is where some of that relevant case law comes into play. You get to see it on some level in individual sports, where students have been awarded the right and the privilege to be able to compete on their track teams, right, and earn points for their teams when they go to state and national competitions, or the right to practice with them. You see it in swimming a bit. Where you see that hole is in team competitions. And later on in the presentation, I'll talk a little bit about kind of that differentiation and what that looks like. Intercollegiate, another huge hole exists. Again, later on in the presentation, I'll come back and address that a little bit. And then international and professional. That's actually far more developed than we see at the national and intercollegiate level. With the Paralympic Games, with professional opportunities to play sports, team sports actually, and the opportunity to be professional swimmers, racers, that kind of thing across the world. So who makes it to here? We can all make it to there, but there's significant gaps in our ability to be able to play at those different levels. Just to kind of make this tangible and to show examples, at the University of Illinois, we're really fortunate to have a pretty robust disability sport program. And our student athletes achieve at a very, very high level, winning championships, winning races, sort of what we think of as achieving on the athletic side. And our student athletes, when they come back from a national competition, winning, succeeding, there's zero recognition. There's zero support from athletics, from our university, in the same way that you would see their able-bodied peers receive that. We have had teams that won national championships. We come back and it's just null. And so, and mentioning Tatiana McFadden earlier, and her legend is growing, right? And it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And those of you in the Boston area will get to see that in a couple of weeks. But she was a student athlete on our campus for a very long time before she kind of made this transition into being a professional athlete. And the way I kind of conceive and think of this is, who wouldn't want her to represent their university, right? And who wouldn't want any of our student athletes wearing Illinois or wearing Harvard or wearing whatever school that might be across their chest, because they're such great representatives of your university or of your high school, where those gaps exist, right? They train in the exact same way, they compete in the exact same way. So, that gap exists there, and it's a gap that we're looking to fill. Just looking at kind of based off that last little chart, when we talk about being otherwise qualified to participate in all of these levels of competition, what we're basically talking about is skill and talent, right? Like you meet certain criteria of age or of gender or of classification level, whatever it might be. But then we have this kind of otherwise qualified caveat, and that equals skill. And it narrows as you get higher, right? You have to have a higher level of skill as you get higher and higher on the chart. And for athletes with disabilities, you don't move up this chart just because you're disabled. And you don't move up this sort of progression just because you happen to be somebody that has a disability that lives in this area. You have to have skill. It's an intentional way for you to get to that point. And so it's really important to understand those two parallels between how able-bodied athletes rise to that pinnacle and how athletes with disabilities rise to that pinnacle. Just to kind of touch on and go back to the case law a little bit, there is a growing demand for participation, and that's the question that we get a lot is who's going to play? Where is the critical mass? Where are the athletes that are demanding? Well, it's there. We kind of have our outliers of people like Tatiana McFadden, or when you look at in the Olympic Games with like a Natalie Dutoit or somebody like that who has competed with a disability at both the Olympic and Paralympic level. You have these outliers, and while they're great to sort of start the conversation, they don't sustain, right? Critical mass is what sustains competition at a higher level. And so there are student athletes that are demanding equal treatment as varsity athletes, through those administrative complaints and lawsuits. Athletes with disabilities are going to impact a greater demand for similar opportunities at the collegiate level. We're beginning to see that now as we move forward. And then I think as this generation's coming up, they're going to be more expectant of equality. And they're going to know their rights, and they're going to know that this is not a privilege for them to be able to participate in sport. It is their right. This is kind of where we start to move in a little bit into gender. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the needs and barriers are with athletes with disabilities, but it's going to bleed a little bit into gender. And because I think the two are very similar, I think that athletes with disabilities are kind of almost following a path of where we've seen women athletes come from. So, no matter how it's presented or couched, discrimination towards students with disabilities is still discrimination. And it's very similar to issues surrounding race, gender, sexual orientation. So the process that women athletes had to go through during Title IX to get access to sport, our student athletes are going through right now. It's a very relevant time for our student athletes. We're often viewed as not equal to our peers. I see this every single day on campus at the University of Illinois. And we are actually seeing someone who is a leader in this aspect. But on a day-to-day basis, I see the inequality of what our student athletes have to go through. Small example, access to the student athlete dining hall, right? Like something that seems pretty simple, where student athletes can go in, they can grab food on their way to class, after practice, ability to recover. Our student athletes don't have access to that option. They have to sort of fend for meals, however they can fend for meals to properly recover, right? Small example, but has a huge impact across the board in what our student athletes experience. I think old myths and perceptions, that is probably the single biggest barrier to students with disabilities right now. Again, goes back to that similarity of women in sport. Like, what were the old myths and stereotypes that women had to deal with, as we spoke about earlier with it's not good physically, right? Like, you're going to stop having your menstrual cycle. Like, all of those things that are based on myths and stereotypes, you encounter those with our student athletes with disabilities. So we see able-bodied sport as the norm. There is a diminished value of sport and leisure activities for people with disabilities. There's lack of education and expertise on what disability sport is and who can play. And there's a wide range of individuals of who can play disability sport. And that kind of leads into that next piece, which is classification. I'll come back to that in a second. So just the role of gender and how it combines with disability. When we kind of go back and we look at what those myths and stereotypes are for gender, with disability, they bleed into gender. So how does society attach meaning to disability? right? When we have an image in our minds of what someone with a disability looks like, what they're able to do, right? We have pretty low standards, or historically we've had pretty low standards, low expectations. We don't expect them to be physical, right? Like we don't expect them to expect physical activity. We don't expect them to be able to achieve on a high level. We hold them to lower standards. A lot of this evolves out of the medical model of disability, right? And I think in order to take that next step with disability sport, it's evolving into more of a social model with disability. And so it's surrounded with pity, right? You look at that person with a disability and you kind of feel sorry for them that they can't do this or can't do that. And so what we try to do with disability sport, and now adding in gender into it, we're trying to flip that, right? And attach a different meaning to disability. So looking at the social construction of sport, that is also a critical factor that impacts perceptions related to the participation of women with physical disabilities in sport, right? Because now you have these conceptions of what individuals with disability looks like, what they're capable are. Now you add gender onto it, and you get that double whammy effect, right? And so someone who, as an individual with a disability, is supposed to be frail, fragile, weak, low expectations, not being physical. You confound that now with a female who is supposed to be weak, sit on the sidelines, clap politely. And you put those two together and you create this rub between what our expectations are and what reality can be and what we have the opportunity to do. So, it leads to those conflicting expectations. We do have negative perceptions and stereotypes. I can't tell you how many times that I've heard, it's so great that you guys get to get out and play sport. And that's just on the disability level. Or as a female athlete, times where my team was really good and we had to play against men's teams. And some of the derogatory terms that you heard, telling you to get off the court, telling you you're not welcome against this team, telling you they're gonna go back out and beat up one of your teammates. Like those were things that were just realities as we moved forward through this process. Just to give a couple of examples on touching on the Paralympic Games. So we had about 38% participation, 43% of medal events, which was almost a 10% increase from London, so that's positive. That piece is growing. So that's kind of the role that gender plays. What I'm gonna do really quickly, because I'm running out of time, is run through a real world example of what's happening right now. There's been a little bit of slow progress with this, but those of you guys on the East Coast know about the ECAC, a really awesome athletic conference. What they have done is they have adopted an inclusive sport model a couple of years ago, and it's based on principles of inclusion depending on a person-specific disability and their ability to compete at a varsity level, otherwise qualified, right? So as we kind of go through of what inclusive sport looks like, and this will be a really quick run through, the first couple of principles are where student athletes can participate on existing teams with either no accommodations or some small accommodations that don't affect the sport. So if we look at, that's Marla Runyon, she's the first runner there, blind athlete, able to run without a guide, right? Doesn't significantly impact the sport. We have Anthony Robles here, who's a wrestler, won a Division I national title at Arizona State, a swimmer here competing for her university. So that does not significantly alter sport, right? You're not changing the sport. Third principle, inclusion of athletes with a disability through the addition of adapted events. So this is when you see track and field athletes who compete in our wheelchair divisions, that's Tatiana McFadden. The addition of events with a guide runner or for amputees that are separate events, but you're still, winning points, so to say, at your events. Swimming, pairs rowing, wheelchair tennis. And then lastly, it's the inclusion of athletes with a disability through the creation of adapted team sports. And this is kind of what I was talking about earlier. This is where the donut hole exists. This is where we don't do a really great job right now at the scholastic level of inclusion of athletes with disabilities. And so this is wheelchair basketball. It's kind of your traditional team sports, sled hockey, sitting volleyball, and goalball. So that's kind of like a really quick and dirty version of where we are with disability sport, kind of where we've come from, how it's been seen as a privilege for individuals with disabilities to be able to participate in sport, how that then compounds with gender, right, and makes it even more difficult to access with added layers of discrimination for women with disabilities, and then sort of where we can be in the future and where we can go with disability sport if we just sort of think outside of that model that we have right now for sport.
Well, I would like to commend my panelists for coming in on time or under time and also giving us so much to think about to start our day, and that's really what we had hoped for when we were planning this. I think what I'd like to do is allow them to sort of talk about sort of step back and talk about some big issues and some themes that have come through. And I think the one that really sticks out for me is this idea of sports as a birthright that all humans enjoy, and then also what are the challenges women face in claiming that birthright. But I think, Anita, for you especially, that's your philosophy of sports.
Yeah, for a long time I believed that, maybe growing up with 3 brothers and not understanding why I couldn't get onto the basketball court, and I couldn't. It didn't make sense to me why I did not have this access. And my parents were well evolved. I could cut the grass and my brothers could wash the dishes. But there was this whole area that was disallowed me, and it did not seem fair. And it wasn't fair because all humans have this desire to take part in sport. It's the one thing that we do as a species that no other species does. If you've heard me speak before, I've referenced the fact that whether species sets up hurdles and races across them to see who will get to the finish line first. I referenced that I've seen an ant climb onto a twig to get across a puddle of water. I've never seen them line up those twigs to get across a puddle of water. It's something that we enjoy doing. We enjoy talking about it. We enjoy taking part in sport. We enjoy the history of it. It brings us together as communities. It helps us enjoy people's success. It helps us get into that zone of excellence, which I think we need to study more. But it's something that we do as humans, and it's not just some humans. It's not just one half of humanity. It's all humans.
Stephanie?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I look at this through the lens of disability, and it's something, like I mentioned, where it's seen as individual disabilities that they don't have the desire to compete, and they don't have the desire to challenge themselves at that high level, and that's just completely untrue. And I think if you look across the board internationally, there are barriers in place over and over again that show those individuals that it is a privilege, and it addresses that larger question of, kind of what bodies are able and what bodies do we see as able, and from a gender perspective and from a disability perspective, and, what bodies have the right to be able to participate. So I completely agree with that, and, it's important that we, as much as we can, remove those systemic barriers, right? Like that's kind of what creates sport as a privilege, is that there's those systemic barriers in place to saying who can play and who can get to that starting line. And so, it's kind of on us and everybody here to begin to remove those and reconceptualize, especially, again, I come from the disability sport angle, reconceptualize what that looks like reconceptualize what sport looks like and what bodies that can compete look like and how it's their right.
I think we're speaking to the choir in terms of a birthright. But
speak.
No. Seriously, no child should ever be told that you cannot pursue your dreams. I don't care whether it's sport or being an engineer or a fire person or any of it. I think we're all of that mode. But if the right has been denied, then I think we have to jump into can we change the legal system to make sure it's a right. And that's what was done with Title IX. I thought it was very interesting in Stephanie's presentation. You can see the Dear Colleague letter on disability did not come out until 2014. And that's the equivalent of the regulation that got done before Title IX was even in place. And I could kick myself, having been with the Women's Sports Foundation, in not embracing the need, in the case of disabled sport, to go after those same regulations under disability. It were no excuse. It was, fortunately, Terry Lukowski, from the foundation, was very helpful in that Dear Colleague letter. But if McFadden never called the Women's Sports Foundation, Terry wouldn't have been there. That Dear Colleague letter wouldn't have been there. We've got to make this legal thing. And I have a question for Anita. is it true that in the rest of the world, when you look at our experience with Title IX, we have a legal right that is actionable in the courts, where in the rest of the world, most countries take civil rights and throw them under a civil rights commission that is not as strong an enforcement body as courts? Is that accurate to say, or does anybody in the audience who's a lawyer want to comment on it? I mean,
my answer would be possibly.
Yeah, because that's what happened in Canada. When our American women challenged the use of artificial turf for World Cup, right?
Soccer, football.
In Canada, they don't have a court. A right to pursue civil rights action in the courts. It's a civil rights commission that's a weak sister. So that would have been a place to do it, you know what I mean?
But they have a different system because sports is a part of the government, unlike the system in the United States. So they have other avenues to take action.
Yeah. It's an interesting place.
We still haven't signed CEDAW yet.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a historian, and I at one point had looked to see whether there was anything equivalent to Title IX globally, and there wasn't. There does seem to be, through the various United Nations Commissions on Women, International Women's Year, the topic began to get on the agenda, and it seems that the kind of breakout decade for the United States was the 70s. I think globally, the breakout decade was the 90s, when things really started to pop in terms of gender. And I think that the UN had a lot to do with that. But I think this raises another question I wanted us to weigh in on, because it's relevant really to what we're doing the rest of the day. The United States sports system is not the way sport is organized in the rest of the world. And I know we have a very literate audience and all, but I thought we should maybe explore some of the ways in which the situation we kind of take for granted is not necessarily how sport is organized, starting with state support for sports. So I don't know which of you...
let me just say this one piece of the puzzle, and I think that's a very important point. Because we're one of the few countries in the world that embeds sport within educational systems, and because education is a right, our legal system followed that thinking, and what Congress really did was, as part of the Education Amendments Act, as a condition of higher education funding, it attached this right to education to sport. And we're the only place in the world, I think, that does that, because everything else is, clubs outside of the educational system.
Yeah. Well, in Europe, there's a heavy right to work part to it. So sports protected, but only once you get to the point where it's your avocation, or your vocation, not avocation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. I think for us, for athletes with disabilities, I think our process is directly tied to the education process, right? And it's physical activity is a part of the education process of children with disabilities that has been largely ignored. And I can speak from personal experience on that, as far as physical education opportunities within school, and then opportunities outside of school for those recreational opportunities. And so that's been the big push, is the tie to education for individuals with disabilities. They're missing this huge piece of their right to be educated. Mm-hmm. And then the other side of that too is we see the education process of kind of the larger population or public of that school, right? Because we have such that ingrained picture of what an individual with a disability looks like and what they can do. And so when you take that individual, for someone who sits on the sidelines at PE, right? They keep score. They're the goalie that just sits in the goal and they don't do anything. When you take them and you move them from that position and you put them into a position where they're active and they're actively giving to that social environment, it completely changes the paradigm and the lens through which you see that person, right? So it educates the rest of the class or the school or whatever it might be. And so it's tied to the educational process in two really big ways, which makes it, that's that educational right of everyone.
I think I have one more question for the panel before I open it up, and it really came to me this morning, and I was thinking that here I have 3 women who have been able, or are in the process, of making a career out of being in the world of sports. And I think that is something we should mark, and it didn't used to happen. But I wondered, since you all have been able to really do that, if you had any advice for people as they're contemplating a career in this area. I mean, we've certainly given them plenty of reasons to realize why it needs to be done, but if there was anything you wanted to pass along.
Oh, well, you know, I just, I think the barriers to women in sport right now are the male dominance of men. This whole issue of homologous reproduction, where the current white male power structure is in the process of reproducing itself, not necessarily intentionally, but we hire people who look like us. We hire people who are comfortable. And this is a systems problem. We have to have schools and sport organizations that follow systems that prevent discrimination in terms of hiring. And that means search committees that are minority dominated. That means not one of your finalists being a minority person. It means at least 30%, research shows, at least 30% of that finalist pool has to be, you know, an underrepresented minority in order for this change to take place. We've got to hit all those spots, and we have not done that in terms of this organizational system that has to be put in place.
One thing I would say is I didn't listen to. I had a couple of opportunities. So I've been fortunate to coach at the international level, both at the junior and senior national team level. And at the Paralympic Games last year, for wheelchair basketball, I was the only female with a disability that was a head coach of a wheelchair basketball team. And that's just unacceptable in our sport. And so, and the path to get there was challenging. And my first international coaching job, I actually kind of got in a roundabout way with a male being selected to do the job who was significantly underqualified. I was his assistant coach, he quit, and I was moved up to the head coaching position. And when I was starting to think that coaching the senior national team was going to be where I wanted my career to go, our high performance director at the time told me that I needed to take an opportunity to be an assistant coach with our men's junior national team first. And I was like, nah, that doesn't sound right, and that's not what I want to do. Like, I want to make sure that I'm continuing on this path to coaching women and empowering women, and I don't need to sort of take that step over in what he saw was a step up, this lateral step, to make myself look better, right? Like, there's no way. And so I think for me it was, you know, I kind of had the strength to stick to my guns in that way and know the path that I wanted to be on and who I wanted to influence and where I wanted to go. And like, fortunately, I was able to overcome that. But, you know, what always sticks in my mind in my conversation with him is he told me, he's like, you know, you came into that junior national team coaching job through the back door. And I'm like, you've got to be kidding me, right? Like, you have to be kidding me. Like, I outright earned that job. And so that always sticks with me in that process of just really being critically thinking about, you know, the opportunity that's in front of you and knowing if that's really going to get you where you want to be. And if what this person who is he was a white, able-bodied male, what he was telling me I needed to do in order to, you know, achieve what I wanted to achieve. And so that's something that's always stuck with me, and I try to tell that to anybody that I talk to, female with a disability, without a disability, whatever, is just that, you know, you kind of have to know where you're going and have an idea of it, and know that what someone is telling you that's a move up, if it's not a move up, if it doesn't, you know, vibe with what your passion is and where you want to go. So that would be the advice that I have.
I want to agree with Stephanie. Naivety is a great thing.
I was super naive. I was young and super naive.
So was I when I went to the University of Texas as the first women's director of women's athletics. I really thought Texas wanted a national championship program. And that's what I was supposed to do.
You did.
And so I was a 29-year-old naive person, but I acted that way. And I didn't know any better, which is good. And I think the other thing is, do not go through this mental process of, I have to be qualified. No male ever did that for a job. Ever. Right?
Clearly.
You are probably more educated than your male counterpart, and there's no job that you can't learn. And so you might as well just go after what it is you want. You're going to be better than 90% of the population.
I think one more thing to add, sorry, really quickly, that I think is really important, and something I had to learn through my naivety, was that it's really important to have a strong team around you. And I've been really fortunate to have a lot of great mentors throughout my career, and one of the things I was really hesitant to do was reach out to people for advice and support. And I thought that was, kind of a brown-nosing thing, or I just had a really negative conception of what that whole networking piece looked like. But it's so important that you find people and surround yourself with people who have been on that path and who can help guide you through that journey. I wouldn't be anywhere near where I am without those people significantly influencing me. So reach out. A lot of times people are more than happy to help. We might think that they're not, and that, they're too busy or they have this going on. That's totally not true.
I think with that, I'd like to open it up to questions. And those of you who've been to other conferences know the drill, but maybe some of you are new to it. There's a microphone in the middle of the aisle. We ask you to come up, to identify yourself, and to frame it as a question. You're welcome to frame it to the whole panel, to a specific panelist, not to go into a comment. That way we can get as many questions in as possible. So if you'll start, please.
Hi, I'm Lizabeth Guggenheimer, and when the 2012 women's Olympic team came back, or when they were competing, I thought, this is going to bust that stereotype of women not being competitive. And then the 2016 Olympics team, the women, right, they outshine the men. And somehow, I think the question of women being competitive is kind of still out there. And the other thing that goes with this is this idea that being collaborative means you can't be competitive. And the most dramatic illustration of this that I saw, collaborative plus competitive, was the last Sunday, the Oxford and Cambridge boat race, that the Cambridge women, when they won, they were just joyous, collaborative, they didn't look exhausted, and yet they were, full of the joys of having been competitive. So I just wonder if we can get through that stereotype. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Okay, it was a rowing event.
It's yours, Anita.
Mine. And rowing was the very first intercollegiate sport where Yale and Harvard lined up those many years ago, 1852, to compete, and it has continued since then. Collaborative, the sport of rowing is I call it the ultimate team sport. Mm-hmm. You have to collaborate. You can't say, I'll be back in a couple strokes and help out, but see you then. And this, it's a team sport, and yet it's called an individual sport, oddly enough. There's so many confusions. But how can you not be competitive? I mean, driving someplace today, how can you not be competitive? For example, you want to get that space, and there's a car in front of you, and you know they're going to get space. Life is about competition in so many ways. And for an individual not to be able to compete is to have is to not be prepared for today's society. And to tell, I mean, there were terrible things being told to women. I had no idea that when I started college that I was going to embark upon a college sports where it was not supposed to be competitive, because after all, we're supposed to be young ladies and competition something bad. It just never occurred to me that that would be the type of collegiate experience that sports was being offered to women at that time. And I'm, when and where you're born is so important, and the time was just right because things were changing. Mm-hmm. I don't know how many of you were a part of that era where competition was bad. You were supposed to learn skills, that was good, but that was enough. It's just a terrible thing to do, to tell people that you can learn a skill but never put it into action and test it.
I think we live in to the first part of that question, we live in a media culture. And the control of what gets on television does not rest with those who are enthusiastic about women's sports, especially here in the United States. And as a result, it's this dilemma that you so aptly expressed. Once every 4 years, we see this bright light of talent, and then it disappears. And society places a value on the amount of exposure and who they see. And so when women disappear, they must not have quality staying power in terms of athletes. It's some terrible kind of a conclusion. And until our digital environment enables us to catch up on television, or our media platforms are such that they're not under the control of the people that they're under control of right now, I'm not sure we're going to make a change like that. Domestic television right now is dominated by the big four men's sports. And each of our major distributors have overpaid for that product, and they are so busy now using every promotional minute, every 2 hours before the game, 2 hours after the game, every predictable time and place, trying to recapture that money, that there are no media rights fees for women's sports in the United States. And we've just got do you see a solution other than a digital solution? Appointment television?
Well, right now, the IOC is working on having a channel, and it's stepped all over the U.S. because without the U.S., it's not going to work, and the deal was made for NBC to have the actual channel in the United States, which could limit the U.S. Olympic team's ability to raise funds. But we'll see. We don't know if it's going to work because we've been taught, as Donna pointed out, we've been taught to, just wait a while, and then the games will come, and you get force-fed for 2 weeks, and then you have to starve for the next 4 years or 2 years till the next force feeding comes along. And that was Dick Ebersol's approach to making the games more valuable. But also, we are denied the stories of these athletes around the world. Sports, Eurosport did the opposite. They taught you who the athletes were so you could follow them, and then came the Olympic Games, you could understand the path that they had taken to get there. So please look at the Olympic channel. It's digital now. I think it becomes onto a channel platform by July, if not sooner. NBC.
Let's move on to another question.
Well, actually, my name is Jane Regan. I'm a journalist, but I don't do sports journalism. That's one reason I came. I also teach journalism. And my question is exactly related to Donna's comment and the other comments. I'm wondering if in the women's sports world, maybe in the journalism world or sports journalism world, are there pressure groups or associations or movements to put pressures on the news organizations and the newsrooms to include and to go out and recruit and include more female journalists and sports journalists? Because certainly there are movements that have not been that successful, and it goes up and down, but of journalists of color. Mm-hmm. There is the non-journalists and editors and stuff of color feel it acutely, the whiteness of their newsrooms. And so there are great proactive activities that the bigger media outlets do, that the bigger universities do to recruit and promote and encourage journalists of color. I'm wondering if you know of, or if we could all take part in somehow, something similar for sports journalists, female sports journalists, because I agree that our society is so influenced what's on the box or on the tablet or whatever, and it's all male sports except for once every 4 years. So that's my question and provocation.
There are organizations. Wise Women in Sports and Entertainment is one such group that promotes women in sport journalism.
Association for Women in the Sports Media.
Yep. There are some groups out there. I despair because there's such direct access through the digital world. I can't do it all. I wish I could. I don't understand why we're not doing more of telling the stories and telling it directly, but we're not, and I don't know why not. I guess because everybody's busy. But it seems logically that once the world opened up for people to be able to directly communicate and to have networking and be able to get the information out there, that it would.
In terms of putting advocacy pressure on the system, it all has to start with data. And I have to applaud AP, Associated Press, for at least starting to keep a report card on sports editors and
bylines.
Who is in our system. And I think we just have to do more of that. So, and Tide's, Dick Lapchick's group, in Florida, keeps it to an extent, but I think we have to get more data about the discrepancies before, and that is going to ignite advocacy. Hopefully that's the path.
I think there really is a challenge to all of us to really always be counting how many women, how many people of color, how many people with disabilities. And because if you don't, and then demanding that it change, because if you don't, it reverts to white male control. And I think that what we have to avoid is a sense of, well, nobody in this room is smug or satisfied, but if you just sort of accept it as business as usual, the progress is going to stop. It may not backslide all that far back, but you have to just keep staying vigilant. And all the things that we're saying, here it is 2017, and we're still raising these issues. And I think we just have to stay on top of it because the problem is there and it's deep.
Yeah, just one more point on that. I think one of the great things that has happened, the only great thing that has happened in terms of Trump's election, is no seriously, we have finally had a catalyst from moving from identity politics to all for one and one for all. And you're seeing that at the grassroots level now, that if you can give me the data point, if you can give me a reason, everybody is going to help me now do this. That has not existed before. We've stayed in a Black Lives Matter silo. We've stayed in a women's silo. And now I'm seeing something I've never seen before in terms of a lot of people jumping into issues that aren't theirs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another question?
Hi, my name is Karen Flood. I'm from the Harvard Summer School. I have a question about wanted to see if the panelists could comment on how sports are organized by gender just fundamentally, and whether you can see that potentially changing in the future. In other words, whether there could be an opportunity for girls to play against girls and women to play against women, but also to try to break down that complete separation by gender that exists in sports, because I think that separation in itself underscores a sense of inferiority about women in sports. So can you see potential in future decades for that to change?
Stephanie, do you want to talk to that? Because in some ways I think your model has some...
Yeah, we actually, in a lot of disability sport, we do that out of necessity initially, because just with the critical mass. And so I can speak from a wheelchair basketball perspective, where we have teams that are co-ed, or teams that compete either... I've played on women's teams, full women's teams that compete against full men's teams. And one of the ways that our organization incorrectly, I think, tries to, they call it accommodate for that, and without getting into sort of a long discussion about our sport, with wheelchair basketball, you have a wide range of disabilities that can play. And so in order to level the playing field, you have this classification system based on that. And you're assigned kind of a point value. And one of the ways globally and in the US and I think it actually does a complete disservice to women athletes within our sport, is like if you're rated as like a 2.5, then if you play on a men's team, you go 1 point down, right? So, which it's absurd. Absolutely absurd. So I think we're kind of already doing it. We don't do it in the most perfect way, I don't think, because if we do have women included on teams, they're treated as of lower value, and in an essence, sometimes become like pylons on the court, right? They're just there to be there. So while we do this out of necessity, I don't think we do it very well right now. I think in order for disability sport to grow, I think there's going to have to be coeducational opportunities just because there isn't the critical mass. And while it might address kind of what you were talking about with sort of the inferiority of women, I think it has to be done in the right way, right? And I think that classification example for us is a way that it's not being done in the right way. You know, I would much rather see them play at whatever classification they are. They hold value, they bring what they bring to the team, and then it's a non-issue then at that point. So we're sort of there right now.
We had a very interesting discussion when we were redrafting the Olympic Charter, and I was the only woman in the room among attorneys, and we're talking about equality. And so they're like, well, you know, women and men, they're not equal. I said, what do you mean? And they said, well, you know, they have the heavyweight boxing gold medal, and then they have the featherweight boxing gold medal, and you would never put a featherweight against a heavyweight. I said, no, of course not. And so that's not equal. I said, but are the medals gold? Are they the same medals, the same champions? And they said, well, yeah. I probably said, listen, guys, men and women are different, and thank goodness for the difference. But can anyone in this room tell me that we are not absolutely, unequivocally, and forever equally human? And that's what we're talking about. We are equally human, and therefore, once you go from there, you stay on a level playing field with respect and treating people with respect. And that's how we got sex back into the Olympic Charter.
We do a great job in intramurals in doing this because we specify how many men and how many women are on the same team, and in many cases don't make any other rules adjustments at all. In some cases we do, but we'd have to change the rules of these sports that have become cultural rituals, which is what makes it so difficult to do. We know how to do it, but the willingness isn't there.
Hi, I'm Layla Juday. I'm a senior at the college, and I had a question about the role of female athletes as advocates. And my question is it fair to ask all female athletes to advocate for their sex, or is there also a role for female athletes just to be athletes and play without having to worry about what their sex brings to the table?
That's a great question.
Take athlete out of it. What's her name?
I can't remember.
She's walking away.
She's out of here.
So the point is, in the face of looking at wrong, if you stay silent, are you complicit?
Exactly.
So if you see wrong, right, do you have a responsibility to advocate? You know, at least to say it's wrong.
So my question's relevant. I'm Sarah Shaughnessy. I'm a staff member here, also a graduate of the college and the softball program. And I'm actually curious about, in your different contexts, the role of male athletes in this equation. And I think the U.S. men's hockey team made a statement about the women's plight. I couldn't help but wonder, what if Federer had refused to take more money than Serena? So I'm curious what you think in terms of outlook in the future. Where do male athletes fit into that equation?
I have great hope. I really do, because we're seeing the first generation of male athletes who are willing to buck their coach's power and the power of the institution at great personal risk. We haven't seen that before. We're looking at the beginnings of unionization among college athletes. We are now talking about the right of athletes to speak. We're now talking about the right of athletes not to be controlled by coaches in terms of what they put on Facebook or what they put in their Twitter accounts. That's a new conversation, you know, a really new conversation. So I'm very hopeful in that regard.
Well, I think in disability sport, you kind of have an interesting intersection, like with disability and gender. And so quite often, when you look at male athletes with disabilities, a lot of times their fight is coming from the disability angle, right? And they don't bring gender in with it. And so I know we struggle a little bit with that, just to make sure that intersection is understood, and that, like, kind of like Donna mentioned, we can't stay in our silo then in those moments. And so, you know, if you're fighting for, you know, your right to be able to go compete as a disabled athlete, then it has to be all disabled athletes, right? It can't just be fighting for the men or vice versa. So I think for us, it's kind of getting over that step of just fighting it or just advocating in your one silo. Like it has to be kind of an across the board fight.
Yeah, there's a group called RISE, and I don't know what it all stands for, but they're working with athletes to help them decide, to make the decision of whether to speak up and what risks that they face with speaking up, and helping them understand that the risk of not speaking up is you go for decades and years wishing you had, and figuring out how to balance those things, because when you speak up, and you might find that suddenly you're not getting the same amount of time on the field of play, and you have all, the coach-athlete dynamic is a powerful one, which needs a lot more exploration as well, and enough said.
I say this to young people all the time, that if you feel because of your personality or your lack of even experience in speaking out that it's not something that's going to sit well with you, find somebody who can. Is there a tenured female faculty member who can make your case? Is there somebody else on your team that you could work with? You could be the researcher. You could be the one that gathers the ammunition and starts planning what should be said. You don't have to absolutely say it. You just have to make sure it gets said.
I think we're pretty much out of time, and what I would like us all to do is to thank our panelists for getting the
Nice job.